The United States has warned Russia that there will be catastrophic consequences if it uses nuclear weapons in its war with Ukraine. According to NBC News, this comes after Russian President Vladimir Putin issued renewed threats that he could resort to weapons of mass destruction, as he ordered partial militarization of Russia and supported a plan to annex occupied areas of Ukraine that are staging votes on whether or not to join Russia. But retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis said that just because Putin is escalating the conflict does not mean the U.S. should follow suit.
Here to tell us more, senior fellow and military expert at Defense Priorities, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So help us put into context, what the actual risk of some kind of nuclear weapons use is right now.
You know, I think it's uncomfortably high. You know, I really believe that, as published in a recent piece in 1945, that we've gotten so far away from August 1945, when the United States used nuclear weapons, that we've forgotten the extraordinary destructive power. And many of today's missiles are scores of times, hundreds of times more powerful than even those two weapons that were used there. And I think that we're too cavalier and too casual about talking about nuclear weapons today. And especially if we're talking about potentially amping up and ramping up nuclear discussions with Russia that could respond in a nuclear weapon being used on any American city or American forces, I think is something we need to be very, very careful about.
Yes, absolutely. You would think that policymakers on all sides, Russian policymakers, government officials, the Putin's administration, the Ukrainian officials, and U.S. officials would have this joint incentive to avoid at all costs even the kind of sloppy rhetoric that moves in that direction. I think what many people are afraid of, right, is that you kind of accidentally escalate yourself into nuclear conflict, the likes of which almost happened right in the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, where you have brinkmanship, and then it gets out of control. Are our officials doing enough to kind of quiet this sort of conversation?
Well, it certainly doesn't seem so. I mean, you had Sullivan, overtly talking about in public that there would be catastrophic results of if Russia uses nuclear weapons, as you just mentioned there a second ago. And look, we have to take into consideration that right now, American national security interests are not threatened by anything that happens within Ukraine. That's just the truth of it. If you go up the escalation ladder and you get into nuclear weapons, now all of a sudden we could be the recipient of that, or NATO countries could be the recipients of a nuclear strike that does not need to happen. And so we can't say, and we must not do, in potential defense of Kiev and their national security, to put our own national security at risk when right now it's not. That would be the most irresponsible thing our government could do.
Yeah, I think it's really important to put into context, what the possible outcomes are here, because I think some people believe that, the kind of mutually assured destruction détente will keep us safe, that nuclear weapons are so serious and so big that it's unlikely that, Russia would actually act. But Joseph Serentione just wrote an opinion piece in the Washington Post titled "Putin Says Nuclear Threat is No Bluff. We should take him at his word." He's a kind of a nuclear expert. I've spoken to him on my own show, and he lays out a number of possible scenarios. He says one is a demonstration shot that a nuclear weapon could be fired over an uninhabited area like part of the Black Sea, but he thinks that's relatively unlikely precisely because it's too much of a bluff and doesn't cause enough harm. Then he offers that Russia could shoot a low-yield weapon, at a Ukrainian military target. And this is something that I've spoken to him about in the past, how contemporary nuclear policy has been about making smaller and smaller nukes that are more and more plausible to use, as opposed to making bigger and bigger nukes that cause more and more destruction. And you could see that as one outcome. Or a large yield weapon, which could attack, he says, a 50 or 100 kiloton range, 3 to 6 times the Hiroshima bomb. And if the target were Kiev, it would decapitate Ukraine's leadership and trigger a direct U.S. or NATO response. And then you mentioned this, the last option that he lays out here is a nuclear attack on NATO, which he says is the least likely scenario. I mean, do you have any thoughts or feelings about what we are likely to see and whether or not talking about those kinds of potentialities might provoke the American public and American political leadership into taking this kind of threat more seriously?
Yeah, I do think there's utility in that. Talking about it, does it give a chance to actually play these out in your mind to see what is the potential consequence for the United States and for our citizens and our country. But one thing we have to keep at the very fore of our understanding here is that Putin has absolutely gone all in on this war. His his regime and possibly his life are at stake here if this thing doesn't work. So he is in a potentially desperate situation, and someone who's desperate and has a nuclear button is much more threatening than the United States, who's not threatened. So we should not risk nuclear escalation when our security is not at threat, because just imagine how foolish that would be to say the United States right now is very secure. There's nothing that threatens our security, and then we take action that could prompt a missile from a desperate despot onto American targets. I mean, that we just can't do that. I cannot reiterate that strongly enough. There's nothing at stake over there that's worth losing an American city.
So quickly, before we have to go, what should we do then to wind this war down without just, giving Putin some massive boon, for his own survival? Because it feels, despite us, all wanting this war to come to an end, I understand people who are, I think, more willing to commit U.S. resources to this conflict, and I'm not willing. But speaking for them, I think what they would say is, well, this is not. We can't allow this to be the case where, because Putin feels threatened, even though we honestly think it would probably be better if he was deposed, but we're so afraid of the consequences that he might do something crazy, we just have to let him do whatever he wants. That becomes very unsatisfying from a policy standpoint, which is, I think, how people argue themselves into agreeing to a more robust involvement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I'll tell you what's also unsatisfying is America getting sucked into a war it should never fight. And the hard truth is that we cannot do anything that's going to draw us into a war. And look, we also have to recognize that Russia has been exposed as being far less capable conventionally than anyone ever thought before. So the idea that they would be even a possible risk of attacking a NATO country, conventionally or nuclear weapons, is just absurd on the face of it, because it's not even clear they're going to be able to win the 15% or so of Ukraine territory they hold today. So recognizing that our security is not a threat conventionally, our NATO allies are not a threat conventionally, should tell us that we need to make sure that this stays contained. And if that's unsatisfying, then so be it. But it doesn't draw us into a war, and it accomplishes our government's primary objective, which is to keep us safe and our economic potentials on the table for good.
Lieutenant Colonel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Always my pleasure. Thank you.
We'll have more Rising right after this.